Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Literature. Today we're going to be looking at blood brothers and focusing on ways that you can meet all the assessment objectives and the things that you will need to include in your answer to get the best possible grade. This session is here to complement your lessons with your teachers and not to replace them in any way. So blood brothers is set essentially across sort of 2 time periods, and Willie Russell wrote it having lived through Thatcherism and the decade of the 80s. The play is roughly set in 1984, and so it takes into account what had happened when Thatcher came to power. So when Thatcher comes to power in 1979, she's very aware that the trade unions have quite a strong hold on the industry in the country, and Thatcher's aim was to break those trade unions. So there were lots of strikes, lots of people went out on strike. Thatcher stood firm and essentially broke the power of the trade unions. What that meant is that in a lot of industrial cities, they started to suffer, and trades that had once been the lifeblood of those cities no longer existed. And one of the clearest examples of this is Liverpool and the docks. And so Blood Brothers is set in Liverpool because it is one of the biggest examples of how a city was ruined slightly and it's Thatcher breaking those trade unions, which takes away opportunities for work. What that meant was that the town essentially split itself into two, and there was a massive divide between the people who were working, the people that had, and the people that had not. Alongside this, we have the Education Act, and at the age of 11, essentially your path was decided for you, and you either went to a grammar school or to a modern comprehensive. Additionally, you could also go to a private school, but what it meant was that at 11 years old, you either went to grammar and learned academic subjects, or you went to a secondary modern and it was more vocational, more trade-based. And so what you can see already is that we're building a divide in society, the haves and the have-nots, the educated, the uneducated, and all of that compounds what essentially becomes a massive class divide. Now, Thatcher had argued that if you worked hard, if you did your best, that there would be opportunities there for you and that you could succeed. However, within the play, Willie Russell explores the fact that those opportunities just simply aren't there for certain people, and therefore Thatcher's insistence that there was no barrier to success is challenged throughout the play. And so when you're talking about context within the play and you talk about Thatcher, it's about how the play essentially disproves everything that she's saying, and about how the play challenges the class and social divide within the country. Alongside that, because you have twins who are separated at birth, what you have is the sort of nature versus nurture argument. So both Mickey and Edward are exactly the same genetically, but they have different upbringings. And so it is clear in the play that different upbringings lead to different opportunities, which lead to different outcomes. So throughout the play, We see Mickey, who is raised in a lower class family, who has very few opportunities for work, who almost is prejudged because of where he comes from, is the one who ends up turning to a life of crime potentially, who is the one who ends up unhappy and miserable in their life. Whereas Edward, who is raised in an upper middle class family, has lots of opportunities, has a good education, doesn't face the same struggles that Mickey does. And therefore, in the case of the play, it's very much proof that it is nurture over nature. What we also see is that class issue where Mickey is judged and Mickey struggles whilst Edward flourishes. And Mickey needs to grow up faster than Edward does because of the socio-economic state that he finds himself in. His family can't afford the opportunities that Edward has. He can't afford to go off to university, but equally, because of his social class, that decision was already made for him when he was 11 years old. Throughout the play, what we also see are lots of references to Marilyn Monroe. And that is because the play essentially starts sort of in the 60s, the decade of glamour. Marilyn Monroe is a massive film star. She is synonymous with glamour. She's synonymous with glitz and Hollywood and aspiration. And at the start of the play, she is used to refer to the boy's mother. However, by the end of the play, Marilyn Monroe becomes linked to Mickey, because the play is quite similar in the way it charts their lives, because it reflects Marilyn Monroe's descent from Hollywood glitz and glamour to depression and ultimately suicide. So what starts off as a positive symbol or a positive motif about glamour and aspiration ultimately becomes linked to the idea of Mickey's depression and how Mickey's life will end. So when we talk about context in Blood Brothers, we are talking about the social context of Liverpool, the setting, what was happening, and this idea that Margaret Thatcher suggested that there was no barrier to success, whereas the reality was that your class dictated whether you were successful, and your class was dictated by where you worked and what you earned, which was also dictated by the breaking of the trade unions. We then have the idea of two identical twins who are separated at birth and have very different experiences, and so we can focus on the fact that it is very much nurture over nature, and therefore Mickey never really has a chance. Now, using Marilyn Monroe and linking him to Mickey foreshadows death, which is ultimately how the play ends. When you are talking about context in relation to the play, it cannot just be a tag on. So when you are talking about Mickey and Edward and the idea of class divide and nature versus nurture, it is important to recognise why that's key and what Willie Russell is doing. And Willie Russell is essentially criticising the state of England in the 1980s and is essentially suggesting that Thatcher's politics were a thing that had a devastating impact on the majority of cities in the country. So I'm going to leave you with a question. Why does Russell use the motif of Marilyn Monroe? Link that to the idea of glamour and aspiration, but then that descent to suicide and depression. And essentially, her journey mirrors Mickey's, because there is a point at which he seems to lose hope. If you write a couple of paragraphs and then show it to your teacher, I'm sure they'd be happy to mark it for you.
Well done everybody for completing number 1 of 12 on Blood Brothers, the AQA text for GCSE English Literature. Subscribe to get notified about the others that are coming up in the next couple of months. And just remember, the videos you can get that are all sort of 10 to 15 minute long, so that you can fit them into a revision clock. 15, 20 minutes of revision, 10 minutes break, repeat 3 times. Really optimum way to revise for GCSEs without getting burnt out. Have a good one. Bye.